The night the last officer walked out of the Ridgeton Police Department, the town felt strangely hollow. No sirens in the distance, no patrol cars rolling past the diner, just a brick building with its windows dark and its phones ringing into nothing. For almost 2 days, nothing happened. People went to work, children walked to school, and most residents tried to believe that life would carry on without uniforms on the streets. On the second night, at 9:17 p.m., the silence was broken. Inside a small neighborhood store, the owner, Mark Ellison, was attacked. Security cameras recorded the entire scene. A masked figure slipping through a side entrance, a brief, brutal struggle. Mark collapsing on the floor, fighting for breath, with no one officially coming to help. Neighbors rushed in when they heard him scream. They grabbed their phones on instinct, ready to call the police, then stopped. There were no officers to call, no station to dispatch anyone. Ridgeton was on its own. If you're new here, subscribe for more true stories that reveal what happens when truth collides with power. Ridgeton did not lose its police department in a single day. It eroded over time. The first cracks showed in small ways. Officers complained they were working double shifts without overtime pay. Patrol cars stayed parked more often, waiting for repairs that never came. Radios cut out. Cases dragged on. Then came the lawsuits. Families claimed their reports had been mishandled. Evidence went missing. One case after another was quietly settled or dismissed. Instead of addressing the problems, the town council looked at the shrinking budget and chose the cheapest solution. They cut funding even further. Morale collapsed. Officers resigned, one after another. By the time the last 3 walked out carrying cardboard boxes, nobody could honestly say they were surprised. What stunned people was what came after. Nothing. No interim plan, no outside agency stepping in. No clear answer to the question everyone asked in private: who is supposed to protect us now? Mark Ellison tried not to think about any of that. His store was his world. He opened at dawn, closed at 9, and knew most of his customers by name. He sold bread, oil, batteries, and on credit when someone was short. If people trusted anyone in town, it was Mark. On the evening of the attack, everything looked normal on camera. He swept the floor, counted the money, turned off the front lights at 9:03 p.m. and moved toward the back office to update his books. No one was in the aisles, no one lingered outside. At 9:17 p.m., a masked man slipped in through the side entrance. He did not hesitate at the door or glance nervously at the ceiling. He walked with purpose, head slightly lowered, shoulders relaxed, as if he had done this before. Mark looked up only when the man was close. The first blow came fast. A heavy object, swung with intent, caught him on the side of the head. He staggered, tried to brace himself on the counter, but another hit drove him down. The struggle was short, ugly, and efficient. The intruder went straight to the small office safe. He did not search drawers or shelves at random. He opened exactly what he came for, grabbed the cash, checked the room once more, and walked out the back door. Minutes later, the camera showed Mark dragging himself toward the entrance, leaving a faint trail behind him. He pushed the front door half open and slumped to the floor. A teenager passing by saw him, screamed for help, and within moments, the sidewalk filled with neighbors. Instinct took over. Someone pressed a cloth to Mark's head, someone else shouted for an ambulance. Then came the question that froze the room. Who is calling the police? Silence answered. A woman tried dialing the old non-emergency number and listened to it ring into emptiness. Another tried the emergency line and got a recorded message about limited coverage and unavailable units. The realization hit everyone at the same time. This was not just a violent crime in a small town. It was a violent crime in a town that no longer had a functioning system to respond. By morning, the story of what happened to Mark had spread through Ridgeton. People arrived at the town hall before the doors even opened. The building was not designed for crowds, but that day, every seat, hallway, and corner filled. Fear hung in the room. Parents clutched their children's hands. Business owners sat with their arms folded tight. Elderly residents who had spent decades in the town looked stunned, as if the ground under them had shifted overnight. The mayor stood at the front, behind a wooden podium that suddenly felt far too small. She spoke about limited resources, ongoing talks with the county sheriff's office, and state-level discussions about support. Her sentences were careful and vague. People heard what she did not say. Help is not here. Help may not be coming soon. Voices rose. A man shouted that he would not wait until someone else was attacked. A mother demanded to know who would respond if her child disappeared. Someone asked why the council had allowed things to get this bad. The room began to fracture under the weight of frustration and fear. Then, a calm voice cut through the noise. Enough. It came from the back of the hall. A woman in her early 60s stood up. Gray hair pulled back, simple clothes. Nothing dramatic about her appearance, except for the way she carried herself. People turned. Her name was Helen Norris. Most residents knew her only as the quiet woman who lived near the park and volunteered at the library. Few knew she had spent 3 decades working homicide and violent crime in a neighboring city before retiring to Ridgeton. She walked slowly to the front, not asking permission, just moving as if she knew exactly where she needed to be. The mayor stepped aside. Helen did not sugarcoat anything. She told them what she had seen in big cities when departments were overwhelmed or corrupted. She explained how quickly word would spread that Ridgeton had no working police force. She warned them that the attack on Mark was not likely to be the last. "There is no quick rescue," she said. "If we sit here and wait, whoever did this will not be the only one who tests how far they can go." Her solution was not a speech about hope. It was a plan. She proposed a temporary civilian response network built from the people already in the room. Volunteers to observe and report. Retired officers or military veterans to help with basic structure and safety. Residents willing to monitor security cameras and document every suspicious incident. Not vigilantes. Not a replacement police department. A bridge between being abandoned and being protected. At first, the hesitation was visible. Some people muttered about liability. Others feared confrontation. But Helen did not push them with emotion. She pushed them with facts. She reminded them that the attacker had already walked into one of their stores and nearly killed a man while the town stood unprepared. By the end of the meeting, a small group stayed behind when everyone else went home. A mechanic named Travis, who knew every alley and back road in Ridgeton. A schoolteacher, Maria, organized, calm, and trusted. 2 retired military men, Patrick and Lewis, who had experience following structure and keeping calm under pressure. And Daniel, a young IT specialist who had been quietly handling maintenance on several of the town's security cameras. They gathered that evening in Helen's living room, laptops and notepads on her coffee table, the weight of what they were doing settling over them. Their first assignment was clear. They were going to watch, frame by frame, what had happened to Mark Allison. And they were going to find out who had walked into his store knowing no one in uniform was coming. The footage from Mark's store was their starting point. Daniel connected his laptop to the television in Helen's living room, turning the small house into a makeshift briefing room. They watched the recording once in full, without pausing, to feel the timeline as it unfolded. Then they went back to the beginning and dissected it. They looked at the intruder's build, the height relative to door frames, the way he favored his left leg slightly when he moved. They noted the type of jacket and shoes, the way he kept his hands close to his body, the speed of each step. The most important detail did not come from the attack itself. It came from what happened after. When the man left the store, he did not sprint into the night. He walked. Head down, pace steady, not in a hurry. That told Helen 2 things. He did not believe anyone was going to chase him, and he felt comfortable enough with the area to move calmly even after committing a violent crime. Daniel pulled additional footage from cameras along nearby streets. Most were old and grainy, but one camera mounted above an auto repair shop gave them what they needed. It caught the intruder turning down a narrow alley that led away from the highway and deeper into town, toward streets most outsiders never used. That route ended near a cluster of abandoned properties on Juniper Road. The next afternoon, the team followed the same path on foot. Travis pointed out shortcuts, blind corners, and places where someone could disappear quickly. The alley was lined with cracked walls and rusted fire escapes. A few windows were boarded up. In several spots, the concrete still held faint outlines of shoe prints and scuff marks. At the end of the alley stood an old house at 14 Juniper Road. The windows were covered, the paint peeled in long strips, the front door chained. Yet the chain was newer than the door. Fresh scratches marked the lock area as if someone had been in and out recently. Lewis pried the door open. The air inside was stale. Dust coated most of the floor, but a narrow trail had been cleared by repeated footsteps. The line led from the door through the living room and into the back of the house. There was nothing of value inside. No furniture, no personal items. Just a structure used for movement, not for living. Then Travis saw it. A partial footprint in the dust near the doorway, clear enough to make out the tread pattern. It matched what they had seen in the photos from Mark's store. Behind the house, through a gap in a rotting fence, they found a narrow trail leading to a group of old storage units at the edge of town. Most units were locked and rusted. One, though, showed a newer padlock that had been crudely replaced. The area around the door was disturbed, like someone had come and gone recently. Working carefully, they got the door open. Inside, under a layer of grime, were objects that did not look random. Power tools with labels scratched off, electronics, boxes still showing faint barcodes, a cash register drawer. Maria recognized a few items from news flyers about unsolved burglaries that had hit small businesses months earlier. Those cases had been closed by the police chief at the time, marked as unsolved, lacking leads. Yet here was a room full of their missing property. The questions came fast. Why had no one checked these units? Why had the chief ended the investigation so quickly? How had this stash been allowed to sit undisturbed less than a mile from the police station? Back at Helen's house, they cataloged everything: photos, serial numbers, approximate values. The pattern was too clear to ignore. What they had found was not just evidence from one attack. It was a map of crimes that had quietly unfolded while a failing department looked the other way. Helen knew this was the moment the investigation had to move from her living room to an official desk, whether the county liked it or not. When Helen walked into the county sheriff's office with a folder under her arm, she was not greeted as a colleague. She was treated as a civilian with a theory. The sheriff skimmed the first page, saw words like volunteer team and community-led review, and his expression tightened. He warned her about interfering with active investigations. He questioned whether evidence collected by residents would even be admissible. Helen did not argue. She simply slid a flash drive across the desk. "Watch the footage," she said. Reluctantly, he did. He watched the attacker walk into Mark's store. He watched the calm exit. He watched the route through the alley and the approach to the abandoned house. Then he watched the video of the storage unit packed with property from officially closed burglary cases. His tone changed. He asked for dates. He asked for copies of lists and photos. He cross-checked the stolen items with the reports on his computer. It did not take him long to see what Helen had already understood. These were not new crimes. They were old ones that had never been solved, then quietly buried. All of them led back to Ridgeton's former police chief, Dalton. Dalton had closed those files months before the department folded, writing vague explanations in his reports about insufficient evidence and exhausted leads. Yet the stolen items had never left town. They had been organized and stored as if someone believed they would not be discovered. The sheriff contacted state investigators that same day. Outside the walls of his office, the story began to spread. A local reporter, tipped off by someone at the town hall, published a piece with a headline that cut straight to the point. Ridgeton residents do what their police could not. The article went online and caught fire. Residents shared it. Nearby towns noticed. Questions started reaching county supervisors and state offices. How had an entire department shut down without oversight? How had residents stumbled onto a cache of stolen property before trained officers did? What else had been missed? Under mounting pressure, the sheriff authorized a joint operation with state investigators to execute search warrants in Ridgeton. They went back to the abandoned house, to the storage units, and to a small rented home belonging to a man who had recently arrived in town, answering to a first name and a vague story about construction work. Several residents had quietly pointed to him after recognizing his walk from the footage. Inside his home, investigators found clothing that matched what the cameras had captured on the night of the attack. They found tools consistent with forced entries. They found smaller items listed in prior burglary reports. In a locked box, they found something else. Envelopes labeled CI payments. CI, confidential informant. Records retrieved later from Dalton's old files showed that the suspect had been registered as a confidential informant for over a year. On paper, he was helping the department keep an eye on local activity. In reality, his own crimes had multiplied while he remained shielded from serious scrutiny. Dalton had believed he could control him, use him for information, and close cases through back channels. As the department fell apart, that control evaporated. The informant stayed, but the oversight vanished. When the department died, he recognized the vacuum for what it was: opportunity. For the people of Ridgeton, the discovery landed like a second blow. It was not just that someone had attacked Mark. It was that the attacker had been enabled for months by the same system that was supposed to keep the town safe. The sheriff could no longer frame the problem as a simple crime. It was now a story about a system that had failed from the inside long before the lights went out at the station. The arrest brought a wave of relief, but it did not feel like victory. The suspect was moved to a county facility. Prosecutors filed charges connected not only to the attack on Mark, but also to several of the earlier burglaries. Court dates were set. Statements were taken. People gave interviews that sounded more tired than angry. Mark slowly regained strength. At first, he visited his store only when someone could drive him. The scar on his head remained visible, a quiet line running through his hair. He tried to walk the aisles on his own again, but every sound in the back room made him turn his head a little too quickly. His neighbors refused to let him stand alone. They offered to help run the shop until he felt ready. Some refused to let him pay them. They said the store had held the town together for years. Now it was their turn. Ridgeton looked different with patrol cars back on the streets. The state had stepped in, assigning officers to cover the area temporarily. For the first time in weeks, people saw uniforms again. It eased some fears, but no siren could erase what everyone had learned. They had been vulnerable far longer than they realized. Helen's volunteer team was officially thanked and then, on paper, dissolved. The sheriff and state investigators wanted control back in professional hands. Helen understood. She had never wanted to run a shadow department. But she also knew something had shifted in the town's mind. So did everyone else. Residents began organizing on their own. Not a militia, not a parallel police force, but layers of awareness that had never existed before. Neighbors shared camera footage more freely. Shop owners agreed to coordinate closing times so no one was as isolated as Mark had been. Parents created check-in systems for teenagers walking home at night. A community that had once assumed it was protected started behaving like one that understood there were no guarantees. Behind the scenes, the state moved ahead with a formal inquiry into Dalton's tenure. Investigators combed through old case files, revisited closed investigations, and interviewed former officers who had resigned before the department collapsed. Rumors grew. Some said Dalton might have taken off-the-books payments in exchange for protection. Others believed he had simply been overwhelmed and had buried his mistakes instead of admitting them. The truth would take time to untangle. In the meantime, people kept knocking on Helen's door. They asked her to look at strange cars that had started parking on their street, to help them understand letters they received from the county, to tell them if what they were hearing from officials made sense. She tried, gently, to push them toward the new officers assigned to the town, but the hesitation in their eyes was clear. Trust, once broken, does not return with a badge. Some evenings, Helen sat on her porch, the town quiet around her, and thought about the years she had spent in bigger cities. She had seen departments recover before. She had also seen communities that never fully did. Ridgeton was still in the early stages. The suspect was behind bars, but the story of what had allowed him to operate was only beginning to unfold. And the town was still deciding what kind of place it would become in the shadow of that knowledge.
The state's investigation into Ridgeton's collapse did not produce a single explosive revelation. It produced a series of smaller, quieter truths that together painted an ugly picture. Dalton had not started as a corrupt chief. Early records showed a competent officer promoted into leadership during a difficult time. But as budgets shrank and political pressure grew, he began cutting corners. He relied heavily on confidential informants to give the impression that he still had a handle on local crime. He closed cases early when solving them would require resources he did not have. He became less transparent with his own officers. Those who pushed back eventually left, citing stress and lack of support. The informant who would later attack Mark entered the system at this stage. He provided just enough useful information to justify his status, while using the protection it offered to push his own crimes further. When early complaints connected to him surfaced, Dalton downplayed them, afraid that exposing the informant's behavior would also expose his own reliance on him. As the department's structure crumbled, oversight loosened. Reports that should have been reviewed disappeared into drawers. Internal warnings went unheeded. By the time the department shut down, the informant had been operating in a space with no meaningful supervision. The crimes in Ridgeton were not a sudden eruption triggered by the closure of the department. They were the final, visible stage of a decay that had started long before. When these findings reached the public, frustration hardened into something else, a sense of betrayal. Residents had not just been left unprotected after the department closed. They had been misled while it was still technically functioning. County officials stood in front of microphones, promising reforms. The state attorney general's office released statements about new oversight measures and audits. Task forces were announced, committees were formed. In Ridgeton, announcements no longer meant much. People now measured safety in different terms, not by how many cars sat outside a station, but by how often they saw their neighbors, how willing people were to speak up when something felt wrong, how quickly information moved when it needed to. Helen watched all of this unfold with a detached clarity that came from experience. She understood that systems fail in two ways: suddenly, with a visible collapse, and slowly, with compromises that become habits. Ridgeton had experienced both. Nothing the investigation uncovered could change what had already happened to Mark, or erase the fear people had felt during those weeks with no one officially answering their calls. But it did give the town one thing it had not possessed before: a full understanding of how vulnerable it had been and why. It took months for Ridgeton to look like a town with a police department again. A new chief was appointed, someone known for turning around troubled agencies. He did not arrive with fanfare. He came to meetings, listened more than he spoke, and spent time walking the streets instead of sitting behind a desk. Residents noticed. New officers were hired, many from outside the immediate area. Their cars began appearing at schools, at the market, in neighborhoods that had not seen a patrol in years. Cameras around town were upgraded. Dispatch lines were restructured so that calls could be rerouted if local units were overwhelmed. On paper, Ridgeton had law enforcement again. The deeper work happened off paper. The new chief visited Helen early on. He thanked her for what she and the volunteers had done and asked a question that surprised her. He wanted to know what she believed the department had to do differently if it hoped to earn the town's trust back. She did not give a speech. She gave him a list. Share information with residents whenever possible. Treat community members as partners, not interruptions.
Admit when resources are thin instead of pretending everything is fine. Create channels for people to raise concerns without being ignored. Above all, she told him, do not shut the town out of its own safety again. He agreed, and this time it felt less like a promise and more like an acknowledgement of debt. Mark, slowly, returned to something close to his old routine. The first day he reopened fully, customers came in not just to buy, but to stand at the counter and talk. Some conversations were light, others were not. At some point, someone hung a small plaque near the door. Community strong. He did not know who put it there. He left it up. Helen accepted a limited advisory role with the new department. She refused a formal title. She met with officers, helped review procedures, and occasionally sat in on briefings. She did not want to run anything. She just wanted to make sure the town's memory of what had happened did not fade for the people now wearing the uniforms. Ridgeton would never be the same small, sleepy town it had once pretended to be. Too much had been exposed. Too much had been learned. But in the space left behind by that innocence, something else took root. A quieter understanding that justice is not a product delivered from the outside. It is a fragile thing built between people, systems, and the choices they make when things begin to fall apart. The police had left. The danger had arrived. The system had failed. What remained was a town that refused to give up on itself. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, subscribe and turn on notifications. We tell real cases that expose the human cost of justice and the people who fight to make it right.